So last week we did completing the square. Remember how you have to write your perfect square trinomials? When you're completing the square, there was one rule we talked about, that your a value always had to be what? Yup. So the a value must equal 1. And we talked about some ways around that as well. Okay, so if your a value is not 1, what should you be doing? Yup, you're going to divide by the a value. Okay, so for a, our a value is 2, which means you are going to have to divide everything by 2. Okay, so we're going to divide by 2 because we want our a value to be 1. So you can do that first or you can do that second. Okay, so when you divide everything by 2, you get x squared plus 7 over 2x minus 2. And then we want to keep the x terms on one side, move the c value to the other side. And then what you're doing is you're completing the perfect square trinomial. So we're going to add 2 to both sides. Okay, so remember that to fill in that blank, you need to use b over 2 squared. b over 2 squared. Now, when you have a fraction, it's helpful to also think of it as if you're dividing something by 2, it's like you're multiplying by what? Yeah, 1/2, right? So that's how we're going to do this because we have a fraction. So we're going to multiply 7/2 by 1/2 and then we can square it. So I want you to multiply those two fractions together. So when you're multiplying fractions, you multiply the top by the top, the bottom by the bottom. 7 times 1 is 7, 2 times 2 is 4, and then you're going to square it. So whatever we do to this side, we're going to do to the other side. So 7 squared is 49, 4 squared is 16. Okay, and then we are going to factor. So when you factor that perfect square trinomial, if you've been writing this like I have, you're just going to drop it down. If you write it as 49 over 16, you just take the square root. That's fine too. And then when you want to, I want you to finish this. I want you to get the common denominator, add those together. We're going to keep it as a fraction. Okay, so you should be trying this. Okay, so your common denominator is 16. So if you multiply 1 by 16 to get that, you just multiply 2 by 16 to get 32. And then when you're adding fractions, you just add the numerators. So 32 plus 49 is going to be 81. Okay, from there we're going to take the square root. Don't forget, you need to do the plus or minus when you have the square root. And then this one is nice because you can just do the square root of 81 over the square root of 16. They're both perfect squares, so this actually turns out very nice. And then you'll subtract 7/4 from both sides. Now you can actually combine these, right? So you can do negative 7/4 plus 9/4. And you can do negative 7/4, negative 7/4 minus 9/4. Okay, so I want you to find those two answers and then write your final answers down there. Then you can try B. And then just make sure you reduce your answers. So when you get 2/4, that reduces to 1/2. Negative 16/4 divides to -4. So x equals -4 or x equals 1/2 is your final answer. All right, so for B, again, you have an A value that's not 1. So you're going to start by dividing by that value. Okay, so now you have x squared minus 3/2x plus 5/2. Okay, and then using what we did over here, I want you to fill in those blanks. Okay, so again, when you're writing this out, if it's a fraction, you're multiplying by 1/2. So this is a negative value, -3/4 squared. You square the top, you square the bottom. Okay, so you should be, what you're doing is you're adding 9/16 to each side. When you factor, remember, the sign that you have inside the factoring should match the sign of B. So if this is minus, this should be minus as well. Okay, and then to get a common denominator, you just ask yourself, okay, to get 16, I multiply 2 by 8, so I have to multiply the top by 8. So you have -40 plus 9/16. Okay, -40 plus 9 is going to give you -31. Okay, and these are questions that you'll have to do without your calculator. So when you take your square root, we have to remember that when you take your square root, you have your plus or minus. Okay, this is like the square root of -31 over the square root of 16. Now we know the square root of 16 is going to simplify to what? 4. And then anytime you have a negative inside the radical, how do we rewrite that? You need your imaginary number, your I. So this is I root 31. Okay, and there's really two different ways that you can write that. Often people write it in front of the radical so you don't accidentally put it inside the radical. So that is a common form that you will see that written in. And your final answer you can write as 3/4 plus or minus I root 31 over 4. Okay, that is one way to write your final answer, or you can also write it as 3/4 plus or minus. You can do the root 31 over 4 and put the I on the side. You just can't put the I in the denominator, and you can't put the I inside the radical. Okay, but both of these forms are great. Okay, now we're going to move on to an application of completing the square. So we're going to use completing the square techniques to write the quadratic equations in vertex form. Okay, and so there are several ways to do this, to write quadratic equations in vertex form. We are going to do it using the completing the square technique, since this section is all about completing the square. Okay, so you guys have seen the vertex form before, but it feels like a long time ago. Vertex form is your f of x equals a times x minus h squared plus k. So we did that back in 1.7 when you guys had to find your a values. Okay, and in this form, your vertex is the value of h and k. Notice that there's a negative there. Remember that negative also means opposite. So it is the opposite of what you see. You are also going to have to find the axis of symmetry. And the axis of symmetry always goes through the x coordinate of your vertex. So the x coordinate of your vertex is h, and the axis of symmetry is a line. So you have to have that x equals there. And then you are also going to have to know if you have a minimum or a maximum. So if your a value is positive, okay, we've talked about how that means your parabola is going to open upward. If it opens upward, it creates a minimum value. That's your vertex. If your a value is less than 0, then it's going to open downward, and it creates a maximum value. Okay, so you're going to be picking out your vertex, your axis of symmetry, your maximum, your minimum. Okay, so you have some multi-step directions here. So I take the same directions that you're going to see in your book just to make sure you know how to do this on your practice problems. So the first thing it says is to write each function in vertex form. Okay, you are going to do that with completing the square techniques. Then it's going to ask you to find your axis of symmetry. Okay, then you need to find the vertex. And then you also have to say if that vertex, if it's a maximum or a minimum. Okay, so there's 4 different things that they are asking you to do here. All right, now when we were completing the square, we had things on each side of the equation, okay? So what we were doing is we had blanks on both sides, okay? So if we added a number to this side, we'd add a number to this side. With this, we are going to be working with everything on one side of the equation, and so that's going to cause a few differences here, okay? So the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to group the x terms together. Okay, so we are going to group the two x terms. And then we are going to complete the square like we have been doing, but there's going to be one little difference. So when you are completing the square, you are trying to make this a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so we're going to have blanks on inside the trinomial and then on the outside here. So we're going to fill this in just like we have been doing. So if I do b divided by 2, 16 divided by 2 is what? 8. And then 8 squared is 64. Okay, now before you fill this in, I just want to show you how this is different. So if you have your blanks on opposite sides, if you add 64 to one side, you add 64 to the other. That balances the scale, right? If they're on the same side, if you add 64, what do you have to do so it's balanced on this side of the equation? Subtract 64. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we are going to subtract 64 to balance the equation. Okay, so these two numbers should always be opposites. Okay, so this is what we did. We balanced the equation. Okay, so those have to be opposites because if you add 64 and subtract 64, really, what did you add? You added 0. So did you change anything? No, you didn't change the value. We're just rewriting it. Okay, so once you do that, you're going to factor and you're going to simplify. Okay, so if you factor, you just have x plus 8 squared negative 12 minus 64 is going to be negative 76. And now you have your equation in vertex form. Okay, now really, if you did this like we had been, right? If you move the 12 over to the other side, you set this equal to 0, right? X squared, you don't have to write this down. Just, I can tell some of you are feeling weird about this. If you were to do this whole thing like we had been doing, right? You'd add the 12 over, you'd add 64, you'd add 64, you do x plus 8 squared equals 76. What would you do to get it in this form? Wouldn't you just minus it from both sides? And then it would be equal to 0? Okay, it's the same type of thing. It's just we don't have to flip-flop this back and forth. We can do it all on one side. Okay? So from there, you can pick out your vertex. Your vertex is just the opposite for your h, and then your k would be negative 76. Your axis of symmetry, which you can just abbreviate AOS, is going to be x equals -8. Okay, and remember, you are always going to have your axis of symmetry is a line. So that's why you need your x equals. Okay, anytime you have an equation of the line, you have to have an equation. And then the last thing they ask you is if it's a max or a min. Well, your A value is 1. So if your A value is 1, you have a parabola that opens upward, and that creates a what? Minimum. Okay, so what we've boxed in, those are your final answers. You have your vertex form, you have your vertex, axis of symmetry, and your minimum. Okay, you do need to make sure that when you are writing them in vertex form, that you are using completing the square. That's how you'll be graded on it. Okay, that you know how to use that technique. All right, so I want you to give that a try for part B. All right, let's make sure we filled in our blanks correctly. And remember that when you factor this b value, if this b value is negative, this value should be negative. And then if you are adding 144, you're subtracting 144. So this is nice. 145 minus 144 is what? 1. Okay, so make sure that you have your full form, your f of x equals. And then for the vertex, if you just want to label it v, that's fine. So it's always the opposite. And then what's on the outside? Axis of symmetry is always going to equal your x coordinate of your vertex. And then anytime your A value is 1, it's positive. So that means you're going to have a minimum. Okay, so vertex, axis of symmetry, and minimum. Okay, so the first few examples we did, we always had the coefficient of 1 here, so that was really nice. But sometimes the coefficient is not 1. Okay, so if the do you guys need that for a second? Okay, if the coefficient is not 1, we're going to be doing some factoring there. And then did you guys have any questions on this part? Okay, so we're gonna do some similar things on the back, but we're gonna extend it a little bit. So if the coefficient is a not 1, then we must factor. It says the coefficient, it has to be the leading coefficient because that's your A value. Okay, so you have to factor out the A value out of the first 2 terms. Okay, and then what's going to be different about this is we are then going to use the distributive property to fill in the blanks, so there is going to be an extra step there. And also, just because I know some of you are catching on to this really quickly already, I am changing this one to something else, so don't do this one. Don't do B. Don't do that one that's on there, okay? I'm going to give you a new one. Okay, so for this one, we're going to start the same way. You're going to group your first 2 terms together, and then from there, you can take out your 3. So you have x squared minus 6x. And then just like we did before, we're going to put in the blank space so that we can complete the trinomial. Okay, so you don't want to divide everything by 3 like we did before. We used to have an equation, okay, where it was equal to 0. For this one, we have to keep the 3 on the outside. Okay, so we're still going to fill this in the same way where we do half of b. So half of negative 6 is negative 3, and then we square it. Okay, now when we square the negative 3, we get 9. And normally, if we add 9 here, we subtract it here. But because we have this 3 here, remember, doesn't this apply to everything that's in the parentheses according to the distributive property? So what we have to do is we have to remember we didn't just add 9, we added 3 times 9. So really we added what value? 27. So if we add 27, we have to subtract 27. And again, we just want these to be opposites. Okay, so the 3 just drops down in front, and the rest of this is exactly like what we've been doing before. So this is x minus 3 squared when you factor. 7 plus negative 27 is negative 20. Okay, and then this is your vertex form. So I'm going to give you a minute to find your vertex, your axis of symmetry, and whether it's a max or min. Okay, so your vertex is not affected by the A value. It's still the opposite. So it would be 3, negative 20. Your axis of symmetry should always match your x-coordinate. So if this is 3, this is x equals 3. And then your A value is 3, so still positive, which means you still have a minimum value. Okay, now for y, we're going to start it just like C. So you group the first 2 together, and if your A value is not 1, you just factor out the A value. So our A value is negative 1. So we have to factor out negative 1. You can put the 1, or you can just keep it a negative. And you're only doing the first two terms because those are what you're using to complete the square. Whenever you factor out a negative, it just changes the signs. Oh, yeah, sorry. They're going to be either one. So sometimes they'll say y equals and then f of x equals. The one I crossed out did have f of x. But nope, this one is called y. Or sometimes it might be g of x or h of x. Okay, and then when you have negative 8 and you cut it in half, it'll be negative 4 squared. So remember, this is a positive 16, but if you distribute the negative, it's negative 1 times 16. So you're actually subtracting 16 here, which means in this space you have to add it. So again, opposites. So make sure you keep the negative on the outside. The A value is just always going to drop down to the outside. And then 17 plus 16. Okay, so find your vertex, your axis of symmetry, and whether it is a maximum or a minimum. And then once you've done that, you can start part B. So we finally have a maximum because our A value is negative. So then it opens downward. Okay, notice that this value outside does not affect the vertex. It does not affect the axis of symmetry. Okay, and then if you wanted to, if you were doing this on a test or a quiz and you were unsure, what's another way you could check to make sure you have the right vertex? Or if you don't have your calculator, how could you find your vertex? How do you find the x-coordinate of your vertex? All right, think about it. Let's do C. Okay, so when you factor out a negative 2, you're dividing. So negative 4 divided by negative 2 should be positive 2x. Okay, and then to fill in the blank, it's always half of b squared. So half of 2 is 1. And then don't forget, you have to distribute. So negative 2 times 1. So if you subtracted 2 here, you have to add 2 here. You can write it in the proper form and find all the things you have to find. And then once you finish that, I want you to think about what it would look like if you let's say you had this. Think about what that middle term would look like once you're done with this. Okay, so your A value drops down. Your B over 2 value is here. Negative 5 plus 2 is negative 3. And then your vertex is always the opposite of the inside. And then you have your K value. Axis of symmetry, x equals negative 1. And this is going to be a maximum because your A value is negative. Okay, so the work that you have to show for these is this step. You're completing the square. Okay, and then what if you had something like this? Do you guys know what you would simplify that to? So to get here, didn't we do negative 4 divided by negative 2 to get this? So what's 5 divided by 2? Just 5 over 2. Okay, so if you ever had one where it was odd, you can always divide it. Isn't 2 times 5 over 2 5? Isn't 2 times 5 over 2 5? Yeah, because what happens with the 2's? They cancel. Or 2 times 5 is 10. 10 divided by 2 is 5. Okay, so even if it's odd, you can still factor that out. Okay? All right, and then we're going to write down your homework, and then we're also going to go over 2 things today. Okay, so your homework is page 180. And you're doing 34 through 40 evens. And then 44 through 49 all.